So I'm thrilled to introduce Thibaut Lauwerier, who is a professor at the University of Geneva and also with eduCoop, a RECI member as well, who's going to talk to us about international influence through aid. Thibaut, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Myra. Nadine, if you can share the slides, thank you.
Thibaut, please.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. So to begin with, I wish to highlight some non-exhaustive interconnected challenges related to international influence. These challenges show that mechanisms of colonization persist, but I will only spend a little time on this as David has already covered some of them. So David has already talked about austerity policies. This is one of the main challenges with international influence. Many developing countries have been forced since the 80s to reduce their spending on essential services like education. And this led to the weakening and delegitimizing of public services and to the increase of privatization. Concretely, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, many countries closed teacher training centers, and new types of teachers with a more precarious status appeared. So we see the devastating effects still today on education systems, as you know, especially on the quality of teaching and learning. But more broadly, the strong influence of international entities on education policies is still present today, not only with organizations like the World Bank, IMF, as David said, but or GPE, but also in the framework of bilateral cooperation. And aid is often oriented according to the economic and geopolitical interests of the donor countries. This can be seen, for example, in the choice of countries to be supported financially, or the choice of the education sectors, such as vocational training and so on. So here again, this maintains a situation of dependence. However, I think that when we talk about international influence and this colonial problem, we could place also part of the responsibility for this situation of dependence on the national elites. Because of their lack of political will, complemented by an attraction for external funding, they blindly accept orientations from outside. These national elites are rarely in a decolonization perspective, although they are the ones who should be guiding change. I want to share with you an example to illustrate this observation. This example is based on the implementation of the competency-based approach, which is a curricular approach in Sub-Saharan Africa and other regions. And we have a good example in Mali, where Canadian cooperation first implemented this approach, the competency-based approach. And when the Canadian funding was no longer available, the state accepted that the French cooperation would implement the same approach, the competency-based approach, but with a different perspective, especially from a pedagogical and teacher training point of view. And this made life difficult for the teachers who had to implement an approach with different directions from Canadian and then from French cooperation. But the state did not question this problem at all. Those in charge of this policy accepted this absurd situation. That's why, in my view, we should also talk about internal colonialism when we talk about this colonial problem. But to overcome these challenges of perpetual colonization, we propose to think about opportunities from the perspective of international influence. And these are avenues of reflection that we could then discuss during the breakout rooms. The next slide, please, Nadine. So let's consider that international aid has a role in financing education. One opportunity that can go toward decolonization is that this aid is better targeted, particularly to the most marginalized population, the regions or countries most in need, or sectors such as basic education. And this would lead to This would lead us to believe that international aid is meant to help, really international solidarity, and not to serve a particular interest. What we see so far is that it won't be an easy task. One example recently highlighted by UNESCO is the high share of mobility grants in international aid. For example, Germany is currently the largest donor for the education sector in the world, but about 60% of these funds support scholarships and inputted student fees for those mostly from China and India who study in Germany. So in terms of targeting, we are not here targeting the most in need. Secondly, international funding should be directed for actions decided nationally and or locally. Still, international organizations often come with turnkey projects, programs with insufficient consultation with the actors concerned. When we talk about decolonization, the notion of ownership is very central. Once again, I want to share with you an example, and you can go to the slide 26. I think this is the next one. This is the example of the Swiss cooperation strategy. This country, Switzerland, believes that exporting a model to the countries it supports is appropriate. But in terms of ownership, we are not here in the perspective where the actors on the ground define which approaches are the most relevant for their context. But Switzerland wants to share its own model, the Swiss model, the great model. But once again, here national decision makers must have the political will to provide relevant responses to the challenges of their education system. And I think in this sense, international funding should also be prioritized for national and local capacity building. You can come back to the previous slide. Thirdly, aid coordination mechanisms should be strengthened. Instead of each organization raising funds on its own for their specific projects, which multiplies situations of dependency and the defense of different interests. And I think here it concerns multilateral, bilateral organizations and also NGOs, not only those around the table with the ministries, as David said earlier, but all the organizations should do an effort to coordinate their financial effort. Finally, beyond financial assistance, I think the priority for international organizations should be advocacy for in-depth changes. So it is important to support financially the countries, the developing countries, but I think advocacy should be the priority. For instance, one of the struggle, especially of civil society organizations and member states with international influence, should be to propose actions on debt renegotiations and even debt write-offs for countries in a debt crisis. So David has already talked about this. Once again, today we observe that many countries spend more on debt servicing than on education, as we can see in the table in the slide 27. So if you can show this slide 27. You can see the debt servicing is very important in some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia. So in terms of advocacy, it should be really a priority to deal with this issue. Another example of advocacy, international actions, I think should focus on reminding states of their obligations regarding the right to education. In this case, we should insist on supporting equitable, quality public education systems. And this also requires states to mobilize national funds for this. And this is precisely on this point that I will let the floor to Moira for the next presentation.